Tomorrow, the embargo on reviews lifts for the Intel i9-7900X, which is a 10-core 20-thread behemoth from Intel. But there is already at least one review out there for the i9-7900X, and that review tells us a whole lot about Intel's upcoming processor. First off, yes, the performance is there, and it performs extremely well. If you're a content creator, you would love it, but also the review sort of tells us it's probably not worth your money at all.
And here's why.
Before we hop into the charts, I do want to point out that the actual figures that are shown here come from the Hexus.net review of the 7900X. Apparently, according to the internet at least, Hexus got their hands on an Intel 7900X, but it didn't come from Intel, so they were not subject to the NDA rules there. So their review is live, and I will leave a link in the description below in case you want to check out their full write-up. So here we have the Cinebench multi-threaded performance test, and obviously the 7900X being the newest processor with the most cores here and the most threads, easily beats out the 1800X from AMD, as well as its Intel counterpart, the 6950X, with a score of 2187 versus the 1800X's 1614. That's a fairly large margin and seems fairly significant, but hold on to that for just a bit. Moving over to Handbrake, again, the 1800X performs fairly well, but the 7900X does fairly well demolish it in this test, managing 112.7 FPS to the 1800X's 86.9 FPS. Now, obviously, if scores were the only consideration here, the 7900X would obviously win out, but at a $1,000 launch point, it is a full $500 more than the 1800X was at its launch point. That effectively means you could, in fact, buy two 1800Xs for the price of one 7900X. However, of course, then there's, motherboard costs and all that extra stuff, but just bear with me, let's move on. Now, we already know that Threadripper is coming out probably at the very end of July, and we already know also that it will have at least one 16-core 32-thread variant in the lineup. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of leaked benchmarks for the Threadripper processor yet, but we can derive its Cinebench score, or at least its likely Cinebench score, from the scores of its Ryzen brethren. So the chart you're looking at right now has in red the actual performance of the Ryzen lineup processors. On the far left, the 8-core, in the middle, the 6-core, and on the far right, the quad-core. The gray bar is the projection of these scores based on the 1500X's score. So obviously, the 1500X, both the bars are identical for a reason. If we take the 807 and the 1500X scored and divide that score by 4, that gives us the per core performance of the 1500X. Then you take the single core performance and multiply it by 6 to give us the 6-core, and then multiply it by 8 to give us the 8-core projections, and you'll notice the gray bars and the red bars are very similar. In fact, the 1800X, the prediction based on the 1500X's score was spot on with a 1614. In Handbrake, using the 1500X to project the 1600X and 1800X's scores isn't quite as accurate, as it overpredicts the scores for each the 1600X and the 1800X. However, it does get us at least somewhat in the ballpark, especially for the 1600X. Now you probably see where I'm going with this. The Threadripper 16-core 32-thread processor is essentially two 1800Xs smashed together. So theoretically, at least, we should be able to take the scores of the 1800X, simply double them, and we have roughly what the Threadripper processor scores would be, especially in Cinebench, because it seems to scale pretty much perfectly. So looking at the Cinebench projection of the 16-core Threadripper processor, it obviously beats out the 10-core 20-thread processor in a significant margin. And although Handbrake isn't as reliable as Cinebench will likely be, again, the Threadripper processor will beat out the 7900X. It probably won't beat it out quite as much as the prediction chart shows, but it is a safe bet that the 16-core will win that test as well. Now, you may be wondering why I would be throwing in a 16-core 32-thread processor with a 10-core 20-thread processor, and that's mainly because of the price point. In this chart, we calculate the price per Cinebench point and the price per Handbrake FPS based on a projection of a $1,200 16-core Threadripper processor and the $1,000 that we already know you'll pay for the 7900X. Now, it's worth pointing out there is a good chance the Threadripper processor will actually cost less than the $1,200 price point. So take this chart with a grain of salt, but it also does look like Threadripper should present a significantly better price to performance ratio than its Intel counterpart. So tell me in the comments down below just what you think about Intel's latest attempt to take on AMD. Do you like its approach, or are you still wishing for more performance for a better value than the 7900X is giving us? As always, you can also like, share, subscribe down below to help out the channel. It does help out a lot. You can follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. They're the same tag for your convenience. And as always, we'll queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.